The Oracle Network.
Hello everybody, you're listening to the Sinister Story Hour. We talk about crimes, cults, conspiracies, and all things sinister. If you enjoy the show, please like, subscribe, and leave a 5-star review. You can find me on Instagram and TikTok at Sinister Story Hour and on Twitter at Sinister Hour. You can help support the show for as little as 99 cents per month. As always, thank you for listening, and let's jump in. Hi everybody, welcome back to the Sinister Story Hour. My name is Steph and I'm your host. Thank you for joining me. Tonight's story takes place in Dayton, Ohio in 1992, and it's Christmas Eve when this nightmare begins. This would lead to a 3-day killing spree with 6 people dead in all. Some were people the perpetrators knew, some were ex-lovers, and some were complete strangers to them. A Dayton police sergeant would go on to say that once they, quote, tasted blood, they couldn't stop, end quote. So get your snacks ready, have a seat, I'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back everybody. As I said, it's Christmas Eve, 1992. We're in Dayton, Ohio, and you can just picture the hustle and bustle going on, the Christmas spirit in the air. It's like the best time of year. People are so much nicer around Christmas for some reason, right? The Christmas spirit just gets to us all. Everybody is just out rushing around. Most people are buying their last-minute gifts, rushing off to their holiday celebrations, while 16-year-old Laura Taylor and her 19-year-old boyfriend Marvelous Keene are busy devising a plan. Now, 16-year-old Laura is described as kind of the leader of the pack, although Marvelous has been also described as being kind of the instigator of all of this. People have said that really 16-year-old Laura was kind of behind the whole thing. And she's described as being kind of a natural-born leader, very tough, and in fact she's been described as being tough as nails. But I don't think that anybody really imagined what she would actually be capable of doing. Now together they're busy thinking, they need some money, and the pair also ends up recruiting 20-year-old Heather Matthews to help carry out this plan that they devise. So Heather had just been released from prison a few months earlier. She seems like a great candidate to reel in and get involved in this plan. So like I said, they needed some money. They come up with this great plan, they think, and they're going to actually try to rob somebody. So they all settle on this plan to rob 34-year-old Joseph Wilkerson, who had been an acquaintance of Laura's, and Laura assumed that Joseph would pay her for sex because she had heard that maybe he had a habit of paying people for sex occasionally. So she calls him, promises him a Christmas Eve orgy with 2 women. So they head over to his house. He could never have imagined the surprise. They actually go to his home, they tie him to his own bed with electrical cords, and they take that opportunity to rummage through his apartment looking for anything that they can possibly find of any value. So while they're searching, they find a .32 Derringer, and Marvelous Keene actually decides to shoot Joseph in the chest. I'm not positive at what point this went from a robbery, let's get some money, to murder, but it seemed like such a quick transition for him to decide to shoot Joseph. Laura Taylor actually uses a different weapon. She has a .25 caliber to shoot Joseph a second time in the head. The one thing I could not find is if they took this weapon with them or that was another weapon that they found in Joseph's house. And so I'm not really sure where that weapon actually came from, but 2 separate weapons, and Marvelous and Laura both ended up shooting Joseph Wilkerson. The 3 continue to rummage through Joseph's apartment. They don't really find much to take. They end up with a microwave, a small TV, a phone, a curling iron, and a blow dryer. That's about it. And the phones, if you think back to 1992, we're talking like a cordless phone, probably one of those boxy cordless phones that we used to use with the extendable antenna that would always break off. Not worth very much, right? So they do end up stealing Wilkerson's car, however, and now they set out on a joyride just looking for more victims. Next, they find Danita Goulet talking on a payphone. Danita was an 18-year-old senior in high school, and she was the mother of a 2-year-old. Now keep in mind that none of these teenage criminals even knew Danita at all, and later they stated that it was just simply because she was wearing Fila tennis shoes that they decided to shoot her. They just wanted her shoes, that's it. So they take her coat, her Fila sneakers, they fire 9 shots into the booth, and she's begging for her life the entire time. Danita only had 50 cents in her pocket at the time she was killed, and she's later found dead outside of the phone booth. The last victim on Christmas Eve would be 28-year-old Jeffrey Wright, who was shot 4 times in the legs. Jeffrey was actually Heather Matthews' ex-boyfriend, and he was shot by her new boyfriend, who they had picked up by this time, and he was 17-year-old DeMarcus Maurice Smith. Now, fortunately, Jeffrey did survive that attack. On Christmas morning, Laura Taylor decides that now it's her turn to get even with her ex. She shoots her ex-boyfriend, 19-year-old Richmond Maddox, herself while he's driving, and it ends up being a fatal shot. That's actually all that happened on Christmas Day, and the day after Christmas, Keene and Smith decide that they aren't finished yet. They go and actually steal a Dodge Shadow at a gas station. Next, they're off to a mini-mart where they plan to rob the store. So they end up shooting the employee at the counter, 38-year-old Sarah Abraham, just after she gave them everything from her register, which was only $44. Sarah Abraham died from her injuries 5 days later. They shot her over $44. I can't even fathom what was going through their minds. It's very obvious that they were more intent on killing people than they were the actual robberies at this point. One of the customers in the store was also shot, but did survive the attack. So a Dayton police sergeant spots the black Dodge Shadow that had been carjacked. He expects to be dealing with car thieves at this point because he knows that this is a stolen vehicle. He ends up finding multiple weapons in the car and ends up arresting all 4 of them. Now at this point, police had no idea how serious this situation was and the gravity of what had been happening. They had no idea because the body of the first victim, Joseph Wilkerson, had actually not even been found yet. And the 2 last victims of these perpetrators had not been found. And we haven't even talked about them yet. The other 3 killings that we talked about didn't really have a lot in common, and they hadn't been linked yet. So eventually they do piece them together, and they're left with just really super bizarre circumstances where 4 people, just super young people, had lost their way and spent their entire holiday season basically murdering innocent people. Now, it isn't until December 27th that police receive a tip that there are actually bodies in a city-owned gravel dump that's nearby. There in the gravel dump, they find the bodies of a 16-year-old girl and an 18-year-old man. The bodies were those of 16-year-old Wendy Cottrell and 18-year-old Marvin Washington. In some articles that I read, it did say that Marvin was 19, so give or take 18 to 19 years old. Just to prove that no prize was too small, they actually took Cottrell's shoes as well. So they're literally basically killing people for a used pair of shoes at this point. These murders were committed simply to cover their tracks. They'd just been acquaintances from the flop house where Keene was staying at the time, and they had witnessed the shooting of Heather Matthews' ex, and as they began to get paranoid that these people were going to snitch, they took them out to the gravel pit, and Keene and Smith actually killed them. As for the perpetrators, they were all charged with multiple felonies, including capital murder. Smith and Taylor were both immune from being charged with capital punishment because of their age. They really couldn't do anything because they were so young. Although, I just really feel like they should have been tried as adults because this is so insane. They were all charged with multiple felonies, including capital murder, and Smith and Taylor were both immune from being charged with capital punishment simply because they were too young. Heather Matthews, remember, was 20 years old at the time, but she ends up cutting a deal and testifying, which led to the prosecution not seeking her execution. So Matthews, Smith, and Taylor are actually still in prison. They're now all in their 40s, and they're not likely to ever be eligible for parole, thank God. As for Marvelous Keene, he wasn't really somebody that anybody had ever expected this sort of thing from. He'd never been in trouble, he'd never been arrested, and up until this point he had basically been a pretty good student. His brother had been killed while committing a robbery in 1991, and according to a court report, it had a, quote, profound effect on him. The court report goes on to say he became depressed, virtually gave up on his educational efforts for a time, and was morose and introspective. So that kind of tells you what circumstance may have changed him, although it's not an excuse for what he did at all. Keene moved to California to live with his dad, but returned to Dayton the following year because of conflicts over money. And what I couldn't find was what conflicts over money, whether it was his mom and dad arguing or him and his dad arguing, I'm not really sure. But he had also, after he went back to his mom's house, he had left his mom's house earlier that month and had been staying in this flop house. After his arrest, Keene sent a letter of remorse to his childhood church in Dayton. His defense attorneys argued that he suffered a form of post-traumatic stress disorder that was related to the death of his brother. It wasn't really his fault, they tried to argue, that he had simply changed and that the death of his brother had changed him. However, his life was not spared, and honestly, none of the families of his victims ever really believed when he said he had remorse. He never actually really showed that remorse toward them. Marvelous Keene was executed on Tuesday, July 21st, 2009. He didn't request to meet with any family members. None were in attendance that day. Marvelous's final meal was a porterhouse steak with A1 sauce, a pound of jumbo shrimp with cocktail sauce, French fries and onion rings with ketchup, dinner rolls and butter, 2 plums, a mango, a pound of seedless white grapes, German chocolate cake, 2 bottles of Pepsi, and 2 bottles of cream soda. I don't know if he ate all of that, but that's an insane amount of food. His final words were, quote, "I have no words," end quote. So in this span of only 2 days, 6 people died and 2 were injured. Imagine what these kids were capable of committing if they had been allowed to go free. That is the end of our story for tonight. So let me know what you think. Should Marvelous have been executed? I think it's interesting that he was the only one out of all of them to get the tougher sentence. I know that he was the kind of the ringleader, which made him a little bit more responsible, but I find it interesting that Heather was able to kind of plea her way out of it. So let me know what you think about this case. There is actually a documentary out now that just came out literally like this week. It's an Oxygen documentary, so go ahead and check that out. I think you can go to the Oxygen website. I have not seen it yet, so I don't know. I was basically all the way through my research by the time I saw that was even coming out, so check that out if you'd like to see more about this story. If you'd like to read more, I will put my sources in the show notes. Please check those out. Domestic abuse is something that really, at one point or another, has touched quite a few of us. I do like to talk about it to raise awareness. I know that around Christmas, it just seems to ramp up. We're all stressed out. Things can get to us. And during Christmas, a lot of people deal with these kinds of issues. So that's why I wanted to talk a little bit more about this. And tonight's story is about a woman named Daisy. That's actually an alias. And I will read this straight from the website. The website that I'm getting this from is actually on metro.co.uk. I will put that in the show notes, and I'm going to read word for word parts of that story from Daisy. I liked this story because it talks about her spending Christmas in a shelter after having left her abuser, and I just really found that was just kind of spreading hope for others who may be going through things or afraid to leave this holiday season. So Daisy endured 2 years of physical and emotional abuse, including being thrown down the stairs after meeting her tormentor when she was aged 19. Her partner told her to lie about her injuries before she finally escaped to a refuge on the other side of the country last October. She struggled to adapt to living in a shelter until moving to a smaller independent haven, which is a member of the wider Women's Aid Federation of England, where she found her family and spent Christmas Day. Now, her family is in quotations because